Thank you, Stephen. And I just want to say congratulations, Walla Walla Eastgate Church, on having a Pathfinder Club again. I was told to put it over here, so I'm being obedient. All right, my time starts now. There we go. Last service, people wanted to know, Gus the bus. What on earth is that all about? I'll give the short version because I went 90 seconds over on first service, and it was because of Gus. So several years ago, my wife and I, we were seeing all the stuff. You've seen it too on Instagram and Pinterest. People take a perfectly good school bus and turn it into a beautiful RV. And we said, well, we want to do that. So we bought a bus. And then it had to have a name, because in the Brower family, if you don't have a name as a vehicle, you're short time, right? You're on your way out. So unnamed vehicles are unloved. And so Timmy, my wife, she had all these really flowery ideas for what we were going to name the bus, because it was going to go with our marriage ministry. And so it was going to be like, pure design. I don't know what. Anyway, they were big and flowery until one night we were watching Cinderella. I don't remember which version, but there's a little mouse in Cinderella named Gus. And it just came out of me, Gus, the bus. And our three boys went, yes! And my wife went, no! But she was completely outvoted, and so Gus, the bus, it is. And when we finish painting it, there will be a little mouse logo on the sides and the back that says Gus, the bus. So that's what that's about. Well, it's good to be with you, and just want to welcome those of you that are joining us on the live stream as well. Glad you're here. And today we're honoring Pathfinders, and I just want to say to you as a church family, besides congratulations on having a Pathfinder Club again, did you know that you have now joined the elite group of churches in Upper Columbia Conference that see on average 4.5 extra decisions for baptism every year because they have a Pathfinder Club? So you are now a part of that inner circle. So good job. And you're also now part of an elite group of churches where, especially every 5th year, your Pathfinder Club is talking about money. A lot. And I just want you to just pause for a moment and celebrate. I was with another club earlier this week, and we were talking about Gillette. That club has set a goal of raising $100,000 to get their club to Gillette, and they only have $60,000 to go. You guys are way ahead on this, so keep going. Don't stop giving just because you're ahead. Keep going, but support your club. I'll tell you what, if you've never been to an international camporee, it's like General Conference for kids. There is something that happens at the international camporee where kids come and they're like, whoa, I had no idea this church thing was so big. Because when you gather with 60,000 other people on Sabbath morning, which is what we're planning on for Sabbath, you know what? They're from all over the world, and you recognize we are a whole lot more cultures than what we feel like we are when we live in Walla Walla, Washington. And it's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. So be praying for us. And it's all live streamed. The nighttime programs are live streamed. If you want to see some of the most fantastic stuff for your kids, watch. That's how my family got started years ago. We watched the nighttime programs live, and then we watched them every Sabbath for the next 3 years. We just cycled through the nighttime programs. So this morning I want to talk to you about ministry in the storm, and I realized a few days ago that this message has a special connection to this church. The first time I shared this message was the first weekend of November. And your pastor had been up at Miveden with us as our speaker for Leadership Retreat. Did a fantastic job, by the way. Did you proud? But Sunday morning, he got a phone call, and he looked at me, and he said, I got to go. Something's happened with Rob, and I need to be in Walla Walla. So he did his last presentation. We said thank you, and he was on the road. And that worked out because I already had the last session, and I was talking about ministry in the storm. And I just wanted to kind of pause and recognize that you as a church family have been through a storm. We all have our own storms individually, but you as a family have experienced a great loss. And And I just want to acknowledge that as we think about storms. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories this morning, all of them about storms. First one from the Old Testament, second one from the New Testament, third one from modern days. Pathfinders, don't forget we have a quiz following, because there's always a quiz when I teach, right? So that'll be at lunch. I'll be looking you up, because now I'm memorizing your faces so I know who to look for. So let's talk about ministry in the storm. First story, here it is. And I have to read it off this screen because I made the font too small and I can't read it. So we're going to Jonah, and we want the setup, and the Pathfinders should come up here and set it up. But you remember the story. If we know any Bible story, we remember this one, right? So God came to Jonah, and he says, Jonah, I need you to go and preach to what city? Nineveh, right? And Nineveh was a city with a reputation, right? It was, not only was it recognized as like the most wicked city in the area at the time in their world, it was also populated by what we would call those people. So whatever your group of those people is, that's the people that were in Nineveh. For Jews, those people, it was a racial thing. They hated the people in Nineveh. Which is why when God came to his very faithful and obedient prophet and said, hey, I need you to go preach to these people in Nineveh, Jonah did exactly what some of you and I have done in this room, and he looked up at heaven and said, no way, no how, let me see, I am getting on a boat going the other way, right? And that's exactly what he did. So Jonah, being God's prophet, God's preacher, goes down to shipyard, finds a boat going as far from Nineveh as he can possibly find, gets on board, and promptly goes down into the hold and does what? Takes a nap, falls asleep, right? And so, whoop, I bumped the clicker. We're not quite ready to jump. And so while he's sleeping, God decides that he's going to get Jonah's attention and a few other people's attention at the same time. And so this big storm blows up, and the sailors who spent their lives out on the water are suddenly finding themselves fearing for their lives, and they're throwing everything overboard to lighten the ship, doing everything they can. And finally it comes down to this storm ain't normal. They conclude there's something going on here. This is supernatural. We've never seen anything like it. And so they begin to cast lots to say, what's going on? And somewhere in that process, the captain goes down into the hold of the ship, and there he finds God's man asleep, sleeping through the storm. All these people are crying out, fearing for their lives. Jonah's out, right? He is totally out. And he's like, what are you doing? We're about to die here. So eventually, Jonah ends up on deck, and the lots are cast, and he gets picked. And they look at him and they say, what have you done? Who are you? Tell us about yourself. And then they begin to have this amazing conversation. The Bible says, Jonah 1:11, we're starting. Since the storm was getting worse all the time, they asked him, what should we do to you to stop this storm? How many of you ever been on a team when things weren't going very well? Things are going downhill, might be a church, might be a business, might be a sports team. When things start to go badly, people turn on each other. Anybody ever experienced that? Right? And here we go. And I don't know. I know I'm not the only pastor in the room for this service. There are on occasion times when church boards can turn on pastors and say, what should we do to you to stop this storm? Right? I don't know anybody who wants to trade places with Jonah at this point, but Jonah actually already had an answer, and he responds promptly and says, throw me into the sea, and it will become calm again. I know that this terrible storm is all my fault. Now, that takes quite a bit of self-reflection to go from sound asleep to owning the near demise of an entire ship. I don't know how much time elapsed. Good for Jonah. Then in verse 13, the sailors do what we often do in our humanity, right? When we know things are way out of our control and we are offered a solution and we don't like the solution, what do? We work harder, right? We row harder. We do whatever we can to try to figure it out on our own. Instead of throwing them overboard, the sailors rowed even harder to get the ship to land, but the stormy sea was too violent for them, and they couldn't make it. Then, notice what happens. And you have to pause and really think about how amazing this next verse is, because when we're talking about sailors, in pretty much any context ever in history, these are rough people, right? These are not your church-going, hand-raising, worship song singing crew, typically, right? And these, particularly, as far as we can tell, were pagan sailors. And it says, then they cried out to the Lord, Jonah's God. So before, they'd been crying out to their gods, plural, as they understood, right? They'd been crying out to their gods. But then, after they have this interchange, they cried out to the Lord, Jonah's God. Oh Lord, they pleaded, don't make us die for this man's sin. I like where they start. It's not our fault. We didn't do it. Don't kill us because of whatever it is he's up to. Don't punish us for that. And then they follow up, and don't hold us responsible for his death. So don't hold us responsible for what he did. Oh, and when we throw him over and he dies, we're not responsible for that either. Right? And then it says, they continue to pray, and this is their prayer. Oh Lord, you have sent this storm upon him for your own good reasons. Now that's a pretty far journey for a pagan to, in these 3 short sentences, come to a place of recognizing that the God of heaven has purpose behind everything he does. But they acknowledged in that moment, in their conversion moment, they acknowledged, you are God and you have a reason for what we are experiencing. Let's continue on. Verse 15, then the sailors picked Jonah up and threw him into the raging sea, and the storm stopped at once. Amazing, right? Jonah hits the water, boosh, storm over. Incredible. The sailors were awestruck by the Lord's great power, and they offered him a sacrifice and vowed what? To serve him. Jonah is the only evangelist recorded in Scripture who won converts by being thrown over the side of a ship. It's the only one. Now we have Noah, who preached, we believe, in front of a ship, right? But he's also the least effective evangelist in history. 120 years, he gets 8. Pretty poor. So they pick him up, throw him over, and the sailors are awestruck, and they vow to serve God. So there he's got his first converts are the ones who threw him out of the ship. Let's jump ahead to the New Testament. One of my favorite stories found in Mark. I love how Mark tells these action stories. He's all about the action. And this one's in Mark 4, if you're following along in your Bible, your tablet. As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, let's cross to the other side of the lake. So he's been teaching on the far side of the lake, had an amazing day, all kinds of miracles. So they took Jesus in the boat, and they started out leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. So you imagine all these little boats, boop, 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 leaving the shores. The sun's going down. That's how I imagine it. Other boats followed. But soon, what happened? A fierce storm came up. High waves breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Does this sound familiar to anybody else? There's amazing similarities between these two stories, Old and New Testament. And here, once again, we have men who spent their lives on the water, making their living there, finding themselves terrified by a storm. But where is Jesus? Once again, we see a character, the prime character at the center of the story, asleep in the boat in the middle of a huge storm while others are fearing for their lives. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" I would just like to be there for that moment, right? Just to have my phone out and video on. "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" As they're yelling over the wind, and they're yelling while they're bailing, right? Wind howling through what's left of their shredded sail. And then Jesus wakes up. He wakes up, and this is where the two stories take different tracks. When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Silence, be still." Whew. That was it. That was the end of it. Suddenly, the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. And then he asked them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Now, I love that question. And I can just imagine it, and this is one of the rare times in the Gospels when Peter doesn't get his mouth open instantly to answer the obvious answer. Because there is an obvious answer to Jesus' question, right? Why are you afraid? Because we're all about to drown. That's why we're afraid, right? Because the ship's going down, that's why we're afraid. It wasn't illogical that they were afraid, but Jesus says, actually, it was. Why were you afraid? Do you still have how much faith? No faith. Jesus wasn't chastising them for not having enough faith. He was chastising them for having no faith at all, right? Because if they had had only a little faith, was what he's implying, they would not have been terrified for their lives in the middle of a life-threatening storm, right? That's what Jesus is saying to them. Just a little faith, and you'd be calm. Where is God in our storms? And where do we look in the middle of our storms? Look what happens when Jesus asks that question. It says the disciples were absolutely terrified. Think about this for a moment. They were already scared, right? They were already scared because they all thought they were going to drown. And then the storm stops. The threat to their physical bodies is gone. And now Mark says they were absolutely terrified. Why? Because suddenly they realized they are in the presence of a power far greater than the storm they had been battling only a moment before. They are in the boat with someone who can call and quell a storm at his command, just the sound of his voice. And they're terrified. Who is this man? They asked each other. Even the wind and the waves obey him. You see any waves in your world today? If you don't, lucky you, but just turn on the evening news and we'll take care of that. Or you got some big waves, you see water coming over the boat, might have looked like a pink slip, might look like too much bill at the end of the paycheck, might look like a diagnosis that you hope to never see. Got any water coming in your boat? Anything making you afraid today? When we are in the middle of a storm, it's easy to believe we're by ourselves. It's easy to believe that it's up to us. If we could bail harder, if we could paddle faster, then maybe we'd be okay. In reality, Jesus asked the question, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Because see, it's not about how much faith, right? Because Jesus says another place in the Gospels that if you only had the faith of a mustard seed, which is one of the tiniest of tiny seeds if you're a gardener, if you only had that much faith, you could tell a mountain to move and it would move, right? And Jesus is saying, you have no faith. Here's the thing. One of the lies the enemy loves to tell us when we are in the middle of a storm, doesn't matter what age you are, Pathfinders could be you, could be you're struggling with a certain subject in school, or might be somebody's calling you names, there's bullying, or all kinds of things could be your storm. But whatever that storm is, the enemy loves to come in and say, you're the only one. Nobody else struggles with this, just you. What's wrong with you? You're the only one struggling with that addiction in your whole church. Nobody else has ever gone through a divorce like this, and everyone's going to know. Nobody's ever looked like you do. What is wrong with your body? That's the enemy talking, and the fact is, it's a lie. We're never alone. We're not alone in our storms. God doesn't leave us alone. He was with Jonah on the boat and in the water, and he was with the disciples right there in the back seat, sleeping because he knew no storm is a threat to a child of God. Scary? Yes. Threat? No. I want to tell you one more story. And this one happened right here in Upper Columbia Conference at our own Camp Mivenden years ago, and I was staff there. Years ago, when Jerry Potzer was president, Gordon Piper's camp director, we decided to do for our Friday night drama, that's kind of Friday night's the big night, the big grand finale spiritually, and when we'd make our appeal and everything, we decided to use an album so old that only a few of you in this room will even know who I'm talking about. It was an album by Dallas Holmes, right? So, oh yeah, you're just identifying yourselves all over the place. By Dallas Holmes called His Last Days. Anybody ever heard that album? And I already told the Pathfinders, this is technology they've never heard of. It was on something called a cassette, and they were super cool. They did really fun things. We can talk about that at lunch too. We decided to use Dallas Holmes' soundtrack, His Last Days, and so we rehearsed with it, and that became our Friday night play, and we'd dress up and act out all the songs in the last days of Christ's life. And Jerry Potzer, our president, came to camp a couple times during the summer, and he saw that. And so that year, we were doing camp meeting at camp. And he came to us as leadership team and said, would you be willing to move the Friday night drama to Saturday night so it can be the climax for Sabbath at camp meeting? We said, okay, we'll do that. So camp meeting came, and we had a big tent up on the ball field, and the youth and young people were down at the campfire bowl with the camp staff trying to keep them corralled. And of course, as camp meeting speakers are known to do, the camp meeting speaker went on and on and on. And so we're adding more songs and more skits and more stories and more activities. And in the meantime, something started happening out on the lake that became an issue for us. So part of the set for His Last Days back in those days, we were super high tech. We had these big chunks of styrofoam that we'd kind of carved and shaped and then spray painted so they looked like boulders. And so we had 2 styrofoam boulders stacked on the stage. And then on another place, we had these sticks that we'd gone out in the woods. Every week we'd go out in the woods and we'd cut down these shrubs and we'd stick them through the cracks in the stage. And that was the Garden of Gethsemane, and there's the rock, and we're set, right? Well, as we are stalling, waiting for the speaker in the big tent to finish up, the wind starts to come up. And it starts to blow a little harder. And then a little harder. And all of a sudden, a big gust hit the stage, and our boulders flew off into the audience. And of course, the kids are like, woo! And all of a sudden, it's like beach balls at a concert, right? And our boulders are flying in the air, and they're tossing them back and forth. We finally were able to chase down the boulders, get them back on the stage, stand up the shrub that had blown over. But we knew we had an issue because the wind was getting out of control. And I remember I was program director, I think, that summer. I went back behind the stage, and I'm looking out across the bay from behind the Campfire Bowl stage. And what I saw did not encourage me, because there on the far end of the lake were these black clouds. And it was raining so hard. You know when the sun shines through really hard rain, it's like fingers of rain coming down? It was doing that. And it was blowing so hard, there were white caps. It was white capping all across the lake. And I thought, what on earth are we going to do? And then I began to pray. And I said, Lord, you know we don't have anywhere else we can go. There's no other place here at camp that can fit 800 people. We can't go into Maple. We can't go into the Calf. There's no place we can move to. We have to do it here. And I said, Lord, this is your story. If you want us to tell it here tonight, and I believe you do, I'm asking you to stop the storm. I walked around the edge of the stage, and I was headed back to the PA booth area. And as I came around the edge of the stage, I saw a sight that is still locked in my memory, because there in the back by the PA booth was all of our staff in the cast in their biblical costumes with their arms around each other in a circle and their heads bowed in prayer. And later I asked them, I said, what were you guys praying? And they said, oh, we were asking God to stop the storm. So I walked back up to the PA booth, and at that time, the speaker had finally finished up in the big tent. The adults had found seats or places to stand, and we were all there. And I looked at the guy who was running the sound system, and I said, roll tape. And it really was tape, Pathfinders, back in those days. And he pushed play on that cassette, and the first opening bars of Dallas Holmes' His Last Days began to play through the sound system. And then David Dunstan, who was playing the part of Jesus that summer, dressed in his white Bible costume, started walking down the aisle through the crowd, just like I am right now, nice and slow as the music played, walking towards the stage. Partway down, spotlight catches Jesus. And a few steps further, Jesus, played by David, touches the first step onto the stage. And what happened then is a story I never get tired of telling, because the moment that David Dunstan touched the first step onto the stage, the wind died. It didn't just slow, it died. The only sound that was left was the sound of the waves, because they kept coming, lapping on the beach below the campfire bowl. The music played, and we went through a 45-minute long drama telling the story of Jesus in his last days. Partway through, I thought, I got to see what's going on. So I walked back towards camp. There's a little spot where you can kind of look through the trees out across the bay. And here's what I saw. If you look out from camp towards Hayden Lake, on the right side, we have the entrance to Mawkins Bay. We have what we call Chicken Point. On the left side is what we call Rock Island. And it was as if someone had stretched a line between Rock Island and Chicken Point, and all those black clouds were just stacking up into the sky, just as high as you can imagine. And they were so black and so dark that the lights of people's homes were disappearing because of the thickness of the clouds. But overhead, where we were, stars. 45 minutes. No wind, no storm, just sitting right there at the entrance to our bay. And about 40 minutes into it, some staff came to me and they're like, so are we going to do Afterglow down on the beach? And I said, let's do it. And so when the play finished and people had had an opportunity to make their commitments and decisions for Jesus and eternity, we said, you know what, our custom here is to invite our guests to join us down on the beach where we sing and worship. And we invited them down. Music began to play, and we sang, and we worshiped, and we watched. This wall of clouds just sitting right there, stars overhead. Another 45 minutes, we sang and worshiped together on the beach. And then we said goodnight. And our guests started making their way off the beach, up the stairs to their cabins and cars. But about 15 of us staff stayed by, and first service, one of my fellow staff members was here, a witness to that night. And some of us, me included, looked at our watches because we're curious what's going to happen next. And 15 minutes after the last person started up the stairs off to the beach, that storm broke loose, and it hit camp almost instantly. Lightning, thunder, torrential downpouring rain. It rained so hard that water running off the beach washed gullies. The next morning we came out, there were gullies washed in the sand that were 18 inches wide and 8 to 10 inches deep. That much water running off. But for an hour and a half, maybe two, with all the announcements and whatever in between, the storm stood. So let's wrap up with just a few thoughts that we can learn as we think about storms. First of all, people, even those in ministry, meet Jesus in storms. Those sailors did not think that boat trip to Nineveh would be the place when they would change their allegiance and begin to worship a new God, but they did. And those of us who know something about storms have seen it over and over. People meet Jesus in storms. The other thing that I want to remind us, and if you're in a storm today, the first time I gave this message, a dear friend of mine texted me and said, I'm hearing you, but I'm sure in a storm today, and I knew it. He was. But here's what I want to say to you if you're in that place today. Calm comes. It will not always be stormy. Calm comes. You may be thrown out of the boat, but calm will come. Or Jesus will stand up in the boat and calm will come. Or people may gather around you and pray, but calm will come. It will not always be stormy. And again, through it all, maybe in spite of it all, maybe because, his story gets told. In the storm, his story gets told. And finally, I just want to say thank you to each of you, every one of you, Pathfinder staff, church volunteers here. Thank you for serving in the storm. It's where people meet Jesus.
Would you stand with me? And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God.
I would like for you to bow your heads with me and to pray. Dear Lord, thank you for meeting us here when we worship you, and please come with us as we go about our week until we meet here again next week. Amen.
Would you join me in singing Onward Christian Soldiers as the Pathfinders and the colors leave?
Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. Christ the royal master leads against the foe, forward into battle, see his banner go. Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. Yonder sign of triumph, Satan's host of flee. On their Christian soldiers, on to victory. Hell's found